Chapter 9. Love leads a shrewd man into strategy. Riddlemen of the old school are by now seldom seen. Since the introduction of railways, Wessex farmers have managed to do without these Mephistophelian visitants, and their bright pigment, so largely used by shepherds in preparing sheep for the fair, is obtained by other routes. Even those who yet survive are losing the poetry of existence which characterized them when the pursuit of the trade meant periodical journeys to the pit whence the material was dug, a regular camping out from month to month, except in the deeps of winter, a peregrination among farms which could be counted by the hundred, and, in spite of this Arab existence, the preservation of that respectability which is insured by the never-failing production of a well-lined purse. Riddle spreads its lively hues over everything it lights on, and stamps unmistakably, as with the mark of Cain, any person who has handled it half an hour. A child's first sight of a Riddleman was an epoch in his life. That blood-coloured figure was a sublimation of all the horrid dreams which had afflicted the juvenile spirit since imagination began. "The Riddleman is coming for you," had been the formulated threat of Wessex mothers for many generations. He was successfully supplanted for a while at the beginning of the present century by Bonaparte, but as process of time rendered the latter personage stale and ineffective, the older phrase resumed its early prominence, and now the Riddleman has in his turn followed Bonaparte to the land of worn-out bogies, and his place is filled by modern inventions. The Riddleman lived like a gipsy, but gipsies he scorned. He was about as thriving as travelling basket and mat-makers, but he had nothing to do with them. He was more decently born and brought up than the cattle-drovers who passed and repassed him in his wanderings, but they merely nodded to him. His stock was more valuable than that of pedlars, but they did not think so, and passed his cart with eyes straight ahead. He was such an unnatural colour to look at that the men of roundabouts and waxwork shows seemed gentlemen beside him, but he considered them low company, and remained aloof. Among all these squatters and folks of the road, the Riddleman continually found himself, yet he was not of them. His occupation tended to isolate him, and isolated he was mostly seen to be. It was sometimes suggested that Riddlemen were criminals, for whose misdeeds other men wrongfully suffered, that in escaping the law they had not escaped their own conscience, and had taken to the trade as a lifelong penance. Else why would they have chosen it? In the present case, such a question would have been particularly apposite. The Riddleman who had entered Egdon that afternoon was an instance of the pleasing being wasted to form the groundwork of a singular, when an ugly foundation would have done just as well for that purpose. The one point that was forbidding about this Riddleman was his colour. Freed from that, he should have been as agreeable a specimen of rustic manhood as one would often see. A keen observer might have been inclined to think, which was indeed partly the truth, that he had relinquished his proper station in life for want of interest in it. Moreover, after looking at him, one would have hazarded the guess that good nature and an acuteness as extreme as it could be without verging on craft formed the framework of his character. While he darned the stocking, his face became rigid with thought. Softer expressions followed this, and then again recurred the tender sadness which had sat upon him during his drive along the highway that afternoon. Presently his needle stopped. He laid down the stocking, arose from his seat, and took a leathern pouch from a hook in the corner of the van. This contained, among other articles, a brown paper packet, which, to judge from the hinge-like character of its worn folds, seemed to have been carefully opened and closed a good many times. He sat down on a three-legged milking stool that formed the only seat in the van, and, examining his packet by the light of a candle, took thence an old letter and spread it open. The writing had originally been traced on white paper, but the letter had now assumed a pale red tinge from the accident of its situation, and the black strokes of writing thereon looked like the twigs of a winter hedge against a vermilion sunset. The letter bore a date some 2 years previous to that time, and was signed Thomason Yeobright. It ran as follows: Dear Diggory Venn, the question you put when you overtook me coming home from Pond Close gave me such a surprise that I am afraid I did not make you exactly understand what I meant. Of course, if my aunt had not met me, I could have explained all then at once, but as it was, there was no chance. I had been quite uneasy since, and you know I do not wish to pain you, yet I fear I shall be doing so in contradicting what I seemed to say then. I cannot, Diggory, marry you, or think of letting you call me sweetheart. I could not, indeed, Diggory. I hope you will not mind much my saying this, and feel in a very great pain. It makes me very sad when I think that it may, for I like you very much, and I had always put you next to my cousin Clym in my mind. There are so many reasons why we cannot be married that I can hardly name them all in a letter. I did not in the least expect that you were going to speak on such a thing when you followed me, because I had never thought of you in the sense of a lover at all. You must not recall me for laughing when you spoke. You mistook when you thought I laughed at you as a foolish man. I laughed because the idea was so odd, and not at you at all. The great reason with my own personal self for not letting you court me is that I do not feel the things a woman ought to feel who consents to walk with you with the meaning of being your wife. It is not as you think that I have another in my mind, for I do not encourage anybody, and never have in my life. Another reason is my aunt. She would not, I know, agree to it, even if I wished to have you. She likes you very well, but she will want me to look a little higher than a small dairy farmer, and marry a professional man. I hope you will not set your heart against me for writing plainly, but I felt that you might try to see me again, and it is better that we should not meet. I shall always think of you as a good man, and be anxious for your well-doing. I send this by Jane Orchard's little maid, and remain, Diggory, your faithful friend, Thomason Yeobright. To Mr. Venn, dairy farmer. Since the arrival of that letter on a certain autumn morning long ago, the Reddleman and Thomason had not met till to-day. During the interval he had shifted his position even further from hers than it had originally been, by adopting the Riddle trade, though he was really in very good circumstances still. Indeed, seeing that his expenditure was only 1/4 of his income, he might have been called a prosperous man. Rejected suitors take to roaming as naturally as unhived bees, and the business to which he had cynically devoted himself was in many ways congenial to Venn. But his wanderings, by mere stress of old emotions, had frequently taken an Egdon direction, though he had never intruded upon her who attracted him thither. To be in Thomason's Heath, and near her, yet unseen, was one ewe-lamb of pleasure left to him. Then came the incident of that day, and the Reddleman, still loving her well, was excited by this accidental service to her at a critical juncture to vow an active devotion to her cause, instead of, as hitherto, sighing and holding aloof. After what had happened, it was impossible that he should not doubt the honesty of Will Dee's intentions, but her hope was apparently centred upon him, and, dismissing his regrets, then determined to aid her to be happy in her own chosen way. That this way was, of all others, the most distressing to himself was awkward enough, but the Reddleman's love was generous. His first active step in watching over Thomason's interests was taken around 7 o'clock the next morning, and was dictated by the news which he had learnt from the sad boy, that Eustacia was somehow the cause of Will Dee's carelessness in relation to the marriage, had at once been Ven's conclusion on hearing of the secret meeting between them. It did not occur to his mind that Eustacia's love signal to Will Dee was the tender effect upon the deserted beauty of the intelligence which her grandfather had brought home. His instinct was to regard her as a conspirator against, rather than an antecedent obstacle to, Thomason's happiness. During the day he had been exceedingly anxious to learn the condition of Thomason, but he did not venture to intrude upon a threshold to which he was a stranger, particularly at such an unpleasant moment as this. He had occupied his time in moving with his ponies and load to a new point in the heath, eastward to his previous station, and here he selected a nook with a careful eye to shelter from wind and rain, which seemed to mean that his stay there was going to be a comparatively extended one. After this he returned on foot some part of the way that he had come, and, it being now dark, he diverged to the left till he stood behind a holly bush on the edge of a pit not 20 yards from Rainbarrow. He watched for a meeting there, but he watched in vain. Nobody except himself came near the spot that night. But the loss of his labour produced little effect upon the Reddleman. He had stood in the shoes of Tantalus, and seemed to look upon a certain mass of disappointment as the natural preface to all realizations, without which preface they would give him cause for alarm. The same hour that next evening found him again at the same place, but Eustacia and Will Dee, the expected trysters, did not appear. He pursued precisely the same course yet 4 nights longer, and without success, but on the next, being the day-week of their previous meeting, he saw a female shape floating along the ridge, and the outline of a young man ascending from the valley. They met in a little ditch encircling the tumulus, the original excavation from which it had been thrown up by the ancient British people. The Reddleman, stung with suspicion of wrong to Thomason, was aroused to strategy in a moment. He instantly left the bush, and crept forward on his hands and knees. When he had got as close as he might safely venture without discovery, he found that, owing to a cross-wind, the conversation of the trysting pair could not be overheard. Near him, as in divers places throughout the heath, were areas strewn with large turbs, which lay edgewise and upside down, awaiting removal by Timothy Fairway, previous to the winter weather. He took 2 of these as he lay, and dragged them over till one covered his head and shoulders, the other his back and legs. The turbs, standing upon him with heather upwards, looked precisely as if they were growing. He crept along again, and the turbs upon his back crept with him. Had he approached without any covering, the chances are he would not have been perceived in the dusk. Approaching thus, it was as though he had buried underground. In this manner he came quite close to where the 2 were standing. "Wish to consult me on this matter?" reached his ears, in the rich, impetuous accents of Eustacia Vi. consult me. It would be an indignity to me to talk so. I won't bear it any longer." She began weeping. "I have loved you, and I have shown you that I have loved you, much to my regret, and yet you can come here and say in that frigid way that you wish to consult with me whether it would not be better to marry Thomasin. Better, of course it would be. Marry her. She is nearer to you in position of life than I am." Yes, that's very well," said Will peremptorily. "But we must look at things as they are. Whatever blame may attach to me for having brought it about, Thomasin's position is at present much worse than yours. I simply tell you that I am in a strait." "But you shall not tell me. You must see that it is only harassing me. Damon, you have not acted well. You have sunk in my opinion. You have not valued my courtesy, the courtesy of a lady, in loving you, who used to think of far more ambitious things. But it was Thomasin's fault. She won you away from me, and she deserves to suffer for it. Where is she staying now? Not that I care, nor where I am myself. Ah, if I were dead and gone, how glad she would be. Where is she, I ask?" "Thomasin is now staying at her aunt's, shut up in a bedroom and keeping out of everybody's sight," he said indifferently. "I don't think you care much about her, even now," said Eustacia with sudden joyousness. "For if you didn't, you wouldn't talk so coolly about her. Do you talk coolly to her about me? I expect you do. Why did you originally go away from me? I don't think I can ever forgive you, except on one condition, and that, whenever you desert me, you come back again, sorry that you served me so." "I never wish to desert you." "I do not thank you for that. I should hate it to be all smooth. Indeed, I think I like you to desert me a little now and again. Love is the smallest thing where the lover is quite honest. Oh, it is a shame to say so, but it is very true." She indulged in a little laugh. "My low spirits begin at the very idea. Don't you offer me tame love, or away you go." "I wish Tansy were not such a confoundedly good little woman," said Wildy, "so that I could be faithful to you without injuring a worthy person. It is I who am the sinner after all. I am not worth the little finger on either of you." "But you must not sacrifice yourself to her from any sense of justice," replied Eustacia quickly. "If you do not love her, it is the most merciful thing in the long run to leave her as she is. That's always the best way. There, now I have been unwomanly, I suppose. When you have left me, I am always angry with myself for things that I have said to you." Wildy was walking a pace or two among the heather without replying. The pause was filled up by the intonation of a pollard thorn a little way to windward, the breezes filtering through its unyielding twigs as though a strainer. It was as if the night sang dirges with clenched teeth. She continued, half sorrowfully, "Since meeting you last, it has occurred to me once or twice that perhaps it was not for love of me you did not marry her. Tell me, Damon. I'll try to bear it. Had I nothing whatever to do with the matter?" "Do you press me to tell?" "Yes, I must know. I see I have been too ready to believe in my own power."
"Well, the immediate reason was that the license would not do for the place, and before I could get another she ran away. Up to that point you had nothing to do with it, since her aunt has spoken to me in a tone which I don't at all like."
"Yes, I am nothing in it. You only trifle with me. Heaven, what can I, Eustacia Vi, have made to think so much of you?"
"Nonsense. Do not be so passionate, Eustacia. How we roved among these bushes last year when the hot days had got cool, and the shades of the hills kept us almost invisible in the hollows."
She remained in moody silence till she said, "Yes, and how I used to laugh at you for daring to look up at me. But You have well made me suffer for that since.
Yes, you served me cruelly enough until I thought I had found someone fairer than you. A blessed find for me, Eustacia.
Do you still think you have found somebody fairer?
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I don't. The scales are balanced so nicely that a feather would turn 'em.
But don't you really care whether I meet you or whether I don't? She said slowly.
I care a little, but not enough to break my rest, replied the young man languidly. No, all that's past. I find that there are 2 flowers where I thought there was only 1. Perhaps there are 3 or 4, or any number as good as the first. Mine is a curious fate. Who would have thought that all this could happen to me?
She interrupted with a suppressed fire of which either love or anger seemed an equally possessible issue. Do you love me now?
Who can say?
Tell me. I will know it all.
I do and I do not, he said mischievously. That is, I have my times and my seasons. One moment you are too tall, another moment you are too do-nothing, another too melancholy, another too dark, another that I don't know what, except that you are not the whole world to me that you used to be, my dear. But you are a pleasant lady to know, and nice to meet, and I dare say as sweet as ever, almost.
Eustacia was silent, and she turned from him till she said in a voice of suspended mightiness, I am for a walk, and this is my way.
Well, I can do worse than follow you.
You know you can't do otherwise, for all your moods and changes, she answered defiantly. Say what you will, try as you may, keep away from me all that you can. You will never forget me. You will love me all your life long. You would jump to marry me.
So I would, said Willdeve. Such strange thoughts as I've had from time to time, Eustacia, and they come to me this moment. You hate the heath as much as ever. That I know.
I do, she murmured deeply. 'Tis my crosses with shame, and will be my death.
I abhor it too, he said. How mournfully the wind blows round us now.
She did not answer. Its tone was indeed solemn and pervasive. Compound utterances addressed themselves to their senses, and it was possible to view by ear the features of the neighborhood. Acoustic pictures were returned from the darkened scenery. They could hear where the tracts of heather began and ended, where the furze was growing stalkily and tall, where it had been recently cut, in what direction the fir clump lay, and how near was the pit in which the hollies grew, for these differing features had their voice no less than their shapes and colours.
God, how lonely it is, resumed Willdeve.
What are picturesque ravines and mists to us who see nothing else? Why should we stay here? Will you go with me to America? I have kindred in Wisconsin. That wants consideration. It seems impossible to do well here, unless one were a wild bird or a landscape painter. Well, give me time, she softly said, taking his hand. America is so far away. Are you going to walk with me a little way? As Eustacia uttered the latter words, she retired from the base of the barrow, and Willdeve followed her, so that the reddleman could hear no more. He lifted the turves and arose. Their black figures sank and disappeared from against the sky. They were as 2 horns which the sluggish heath had put forth from its crown like a mollusk, and were now again drawn in. The Reddleman's walk across the vale and over into the next, where his cart lay, was not sprightly for the slim young fellow of 24. His spirit was perturbed to aching. The breezes that blew round his mouth in that walk carried off upon him the accents of a commination. He entered the van where there was a fire in a stove. Without lighting his candle, he sat down at once on the three-legged stool and pondered on what he had seen and heard touching that still loved one of his. He uttered a sound which was neither sigh nor sob, but was even more indicative than either of a troubled mind. "My Tamsy," he whispered heavily, "what can be done? Yes, I will see that you stay Chevai." So ends Chapter 9. Love leads a shrewd man into strategy.
Book 1. The Three Women. 10. A desperate attempt at persuasion. The next morning, at the time when the height of the sun appeared very insignificant from any part of the heath as compared with the altitude of Rainbarrow, and when all the little hills in the lower levels were like an archipelago in a fog-formed Aegean, the Reddleman came from the brambled nook which he had adopted as his quarters, and ascended the slopes of Mistover Nap. Though these shaggy hills were apparently so solitary, several keen round eyes were always ready, on such a wintry morning as this, to converge upon a passer-by. Feathered species sojourned here in hiding, which would have created wonder if found elsewhere. A bustard haunted the spot, and not many years before this, 25 might have been seen in Egdon at one time. Marsh harriers looked up from the valley by wild eaves. A cream-coloured courser had used to visit this hill, a bird so rare that not more than a dozen have ever been seen in England. But a barbarian rested neither night nor day till he had shot the African truant, and after that event cream-coloured coursers thought fit to enter Egdon no more. A traveller who should walk and observe any of these visitants as Venn observed them now, could feel himself to be in direct communication with regions unknown to man. Here in front of him was a wild mallard, just arrived from the home of the north wind. The creature brought within him an amplitude of northern knowledge. Glacial catastrophes, snowstorm episodes, glittering auroral effects, Polaris in the zenith, Franklin underfoot, the category of his commonplaces was wonderful. But the bird, like many other philosophers, seemed, as he looked at the Reddleman, to think that a present moment of comfortable reality was worth a decade of memories. Venn passed on through these towards the house of the isolated beauty who lived up among them and despised them. The day was Sunday, but as going to church except to be married or buried was exceptional at Egdon, this made little difference. He had determined upon the bold stroke of asking for an interview with Miss Vi, to attack her position as Thomason's rival either by art or by storm, showing therein, somewhat too conspicuously, the want of gallantry characteristic of a certain astute sort of men, from clowns to kings. The great Frederick making war on the beautiful Archduchess, Napoleon refusing terms to the beautiful Queen of Prussia, were not more dead to difference of sex than the Reddleman was, in his peculiar way, in planning the displacement of Eustacia. To call at the captain's cottage was always more or less an undertaking for the inferior inhabitants. Though occasionally chatty, his moods were erratic, and nobody could be certain how he would behave at any particular moment. Eustacia was reserved and lived very much to herself. Except the daughter of one of the cotters, who was their servant, and a lad who worked in the garden and stable, scarcely anyone but themselves ever entered the house. They were the only genteel people of the district, except the Yeobrights, and, though far from rich, they did not feel that necessity for preserving a friendly face towards every man, bird, and beast, which influenced their poorer neighbours. When the Reddleman entered the garden, the old man was looking through his glass at the stain of blue sea in the distant landscape, the little anchors on his buttons twinkling in the sun. He recognized Ven as his companion on the highway, but made no remark on that circumstance, merely saying, "Ah, Reddleman, you here? Have a glass of grog?" Ven declined on the plea of it being too early, and stated that his business was with Miss Vi. The captain surveyed him from cap to waistcoat, and from waistcoat to leggings, for a few moments, and finally asked him to go indoors. Miss Vi was not to be seen by anybody just then, and the Reddleman waited in the window bench of the kitchen, his hands hanging across his divergent knees, and his cap hanging from his hands. "I suppose the young lady is not up yet," he presently said to the servant. "Not quite yet. Folks never call upon ladies at this time of day." "Then I'll step outside," said Ven. "If she is willing to see me, will she please send out word, and I'll come in." The Reddleman left the house and loitered on the hill adjoining. A considerable time elapsed, and no request for his presence was brought. He was beginning to think that his scheme had failed, when he beheld the form of Eustacia herself coming leisurely towards him. A sense of novelty in giving audience to that singular figure had been sufficient to draw her forth. She seemed to feel, after a bare look at Diggory Ven, that the man had come on a strange errand, and that he was not so mean as she had thought him. For her close approach did not cause him to writhe uneasily, or shift his feet, or show any of those little signs which escape an ingenuous rustic at the advent of the uncommon in womankind. On his inquiring if he might have a conversation with her, she replied, "Yes, walk beside me," and continued to move on. Before they had gone far, it occurred to the perspicacious Reddleman that he would have acted more wisely by appearing less unimpressionable, and he resolved to correct the error as soon as he could find opportunity. "I've made so bold, miss, as to step across and tell you some strange news which has come to my ears about that man." "Ah? What man?" He jerked his elbow to southeast, the direction of the quiet woman. Eustacia turned quickly to him. "Do you mean Mr. Wildeve?" "Yes. There's trouble in a household on account of him, and I've come to let you know of it, because I believe you might have power to drive it away." "I? What is the trouble?" "It's quite a secret. It is that he may refuse to marry Thomasin Yeobright, after all." Eustacia, though set inwardly pulsing by his words, was equal to her part in such a drama as this. She replied coldly, "I do not wish to listen to this, and you must not expect me to interfere." "But, miss, you will hear one word." "I cannot. I am not interested in the marriage, and even if I were, I could not compel Mr. Wildeve to do my bidding." "As the only lady on the heath, I think you might," said Ven, with subtle indirectness. "This is how the case stands. Mr. Wildeve would marry Thomasin at once, and make all matters smooth, if so be there were not another woman in the case. This other woman is some person he has picked up with, and meets on the heath occasionally, I believe. He will never marry her, and yet through her he may never marry the woman who loves him dearly. Now if you, miss, who have so much sway over us menfolk, were to insist that he should treat your young neighbour Tamsin with honourable kindness, and give up the other woman, he would perhaps do it, and save her a good deal of misery." "My life," said Eustacia, with a laugh which unclosed her lips, so that the sun shone into her mouth as into a tulip, and lent it a similar scarlet fire. "You think too much of my influence over menfolk indeed, Redelman. If I had such a power as you imagine, I would go straight and use it for the good of anybody who has been kind to me, which Thomasin Yeobright has not, particularly, to my knowledge." "Can it be that you really don't know of it, how much she has always thought of you?" "I have never heard a word of it. Although we live only 2 miles apart, I have never been inside her aunt's house in my life." The superciliousness that lurked in her manner told Ven that thus far he had utterly failed. He inwardly sighed, and felt it necessary to unmask his second argument. "Well, leaving that out of the question, 'tis in your power, I assure you, Miss Vi, to do a great deal of good to another woman." She shook her head. "Your comeliness is law with Mr. Wildeve. It is law with all men who see. They say, 'This well-favoured lady come in, what's her name? How handsome!' Handsomer than Thomasin Yeobright, the Redelman persisted, saying to himself, God forgive a rascal for lying. And she was handsomer, but the Redelman was far from thinking so. There was a certain obscurity in Eustacia's beauty, and Ven's eye was not trained. In her winter dress, as now, she was like the tiger beetle, which, when observed in dull situations, seems to be of the quietest neutral colour, but under a full illumination blazes with dazzling splendour. Eustacia could not help replying, though conscious that she endangered her dignity thereby. "Many women are lovelier than Thomasin," she said, "so not much attaches to that." The Redelman suffered the wound, and went on. "He is a man who notices the looks of women, and you could twist him to your will like withy wind, if you only had the mind." "Surely what she cannot do, who has been so much with him, I cannot do, living up here, away from him." The Redelman wheeled and looked her in the face. "Miss Vi," he said. "Why do you say that, as if you doubted me?" She spoke faintly, and her breathing was quick. "The idea of your speaking in that tone to me," she added, with a forced smile of hauteur. "What could have been in your mind to lead you to speak like that?" "Miss Vi, why should you make believe that you don't know this man? I know why, certainly. He's beneath you, and you are ashamed." "You are mistaken. What do you mean?" The Redelman had decided to play the card of truth. "I was at the meeting by Rainbarrow last night, and heard every word," he said. "The woman that stands between Wildeve and Thomasin is yourself." It was a disconcerting lift of the curtain, and the mortification of Candorley's wife glowed in her. The moment had arrived when her lip would tremble in spite of herself, and when the gasp could no longer be kept down. "I am unwell," she said hurriedly. No, it is not that. I am not in a humour to hear you further. Leave me, please." "I must speak, Miss Vi, in spite of paining you. What I would put before you is this. However it may come about, whether she is to blame or you, her case is without doubt worse than yours. Your giving up Mr. Wildeve will be a real advantage to you, for how could you marry him? Now she cannot get off so easily. Everybody will blame her if she loses him. Then I ask you, not because her right is best, but because her situation is worst, to give him up to her." "No, I won't, she said impetuously, quite forgetful of her previous manner towards the Reddle man as an underling. "Nobody has ever been served so. It was going on well. I will not be beaten down by an inferior woman like her. It is very well for you to come and plead for her, but is she not herself the cause of all her own trouble? Am I not to show favour to any person I may choose, without asking permission of a parcel of cottagers? She has come between me and my inclination, and now that she finds herself rightly punished, she gets you to plead for her." "Indeed," said Venn earnestly, "she knows nothing whatever about it. It is only I who ask you to give him up. It will be better for her and you both. People will say bad things if they find out that a lady secretly meets a man who has ill-used another woman." "I have not injured her. He was mine before he was hers. He came back because he liked me best," she said wildly. "Oh, but I lose all self-respect in talking to you. What am I giving way to?" "I can keep secrets," said Venn gently. "You need not fear. I am the only man who knows of your meetings with him. There is but one thing more to speak of, and then I will be gone. I heard you say to him that you hated living here, that Egdon Heath was a jail to you." "I did say so. There's a sort of beauty in the scenery, I know, but it is a jail to me. The name you mention does not save me from that feeling, though he lives here. I should have cared nothing for him, had there been a better person near." The Reddle man looked hopeful. After these words from her, his third attempt seemed promising. "As we have now opened our minds a bit, miss," he said, "I'll tell you what I've got to propose. Since I have taken to the Reddle trade, I travel a good deal, as you know." She inclined her head and swept round, so that her eyes rested in the misty veil beneath them. "And in my travels I go near Budmouth. Now Budmouth is a wonderful place, wonderful, a great salt sheening sea, bending into the land like a bow, thousands of gentle people walking up and down, bands of music playing, officers by sea and officers by land walking among the rest. Out of every 10 folk you meet, 9 of 'em in love." "I know it," she said disdainfully. "I know Budmouth better than you. I was born there. My father came to be a military musician there from abroad. Ah, my soul, Budmouth, I wish I was there now." The Reddle man was surprised to see how a slow fire could blaze on occasion. "If you were, miss," he replied, "in a week's time you would think no more of Wildeve than of one of those heath-croppers that we see yond. Now I could get you there." "How?" said Eustacia, with intense curiosity in her heavy eyes. My uncle has been for 25 years the trusty man of a rich widow lady who has a beautiful house facing the sea. This lady has become old and lame, and she wants a young company keeper to read and sing to her, but can't get one, to her mind, to save her life, though she've advertised in the papers and tried 6. She would jump to get you, and uncle would make it all easy. I should have to work, perhaps. No, not real work. You'd have a little to do, such as reading and that. You would not be wanted till New Year's Day. I knew it meant work, she said, drooping to languor again. I confess there would be a trifle to do in the way of amusing her, but though idle people might call it work, working people would call it play. Think of the company and the life you'd lead, miss, the gaiety you'd see, and the gentlemen you'd marry. My uncle is to inquire for a trustworthy young lady from the country, as she don't like town girls. It is to wear myself out to please her, and I won't go. Oh, if I could live in a gay town as a lady should, and go my own ways, and do my own doings, I'd give the wrinkled half of my life. Yes, Riddleman, that would I. Help me to get Thomasin happy, miss, and the chance shall be yours, urged her companion. Chance? 'Tis no chance, she said proudly. What can a poor man like you offer me, indeed? I'm going indoors. I have nothing more to say. Don't your horses want feeding, or your reddle bags want mending, or don't you want to find buyers for your goods, that you stay idling here like this? Van spoke not another word. With his hands behind him he turned away, that she might not see the hopeless disappointment in his face. The mental clearness and power he had found in this lonely girl had indeed filled his manner with misgiving even from the first few minutes of close quarters with her. Her youth and situation had led him to expect a simplicity quite at the beck of his method. But a system of inducement which might have carried weaker country lasses along with it had merely repelled Eustacia. As a rule, the word Budmouth meant fascination on Egdon. That royal port and watering place, if truly mirrored in the minds of the heath folk, must have combined and Bayan health and beauty. Eustacia felt little less extravagantly about the place, but she would not sink her independence to get there. When Diggory Van had gone quite a way, Eustacia walked to the bank and looked down the wild and picturesque vale towards the sun, which was also in the direction of Wild Eaves. The mist had now so far collapsed that the tips of the trees and bushes around his house could just be discerned, as if boring upwards through a vast white cobweb which cloaked them from the day. There was no doubt that her mind was inclined thitherward, indefinitely, fancifully, twining and untwining about him, as the single object within her horizon on which dreams might crystallize. The man who had begun by being merely her amusement, and would never have been more than her hobby but for his skill in deserting her at the right moments, was now again her desire. Cessation in his love-making had revivified her love. Such feeling as Eustacia had idly given to Wild Eve was damned into a flood by Thomasin. She had used to tease Wild Eve, but that was before another had favoured him. Often a drop of irony into an indifferent situation renders the whole piquant. "I will never give him up, never," she said impetuously. The Reddleman's hint that rumour might show her to disadvantage had no permanent terror for Eustacia. She was as unconcerned at that contingency as a goddess at a lack of linen. This did not originate in inherent shamelessness, but in her living too far from the world to feel the impact of public opinion. Zenobia in the desert could hardly have cared what was said about her at Rome. As far as social ethics were concerned, Eustacia approached the savage state, though in emotion she was all the while an epicure. She had advanced to the secret recesses of sensuousness, yet had hardly crossed the threshold of conventionality. End of chapter 10. Book 1. The Three Women. 11. The Dishonesty of an Honest Woman. The Reddleman had left Eustacia's presence with desponding views on Thomasin's future happiness, but he was awakened to the fact that one other channel remained untried by seeing, as he followed the way to his van, the form of Mrs. Yeobright slowly walking towards the quiet woman. He went across to her, and could almost perceive in her anxious face that this journey of hers to Wild Eve was undertaken with the same object as his own to Eustacia. She did not conceal the fact. "Then," said the Reddleman, "you may as well leave it alone, Mrs. Yeobright." "I half think so myself," she said, "but nothing else remains to be done besides pressing the question upon him." "I should like to say a word first," said Venn firmly. "Mr. Wildeve is not the only man who has asked Thomasin to marry him, and why should not another have a chance? Mrs. Yeobright, I should be glad to marry your niece, and would have done it any time these last 2 years. There, now it is out, and I have never told anybody before but herself." Mrs. Yeobright was not demonstrative, but her eyes involuntarily glanced towards his singular, though shapely, figure. "Looks are not everything," said the Reddleman, noticing the glance. "There's many a calling that don't bring in so much as mine, if it comes to money, and perhaps I am not so much worse off than Wild Eve. There is nobody so poor as these professional fellows who have failed, and if you shouldn't like my redness, well, I'm not red by birth, you know. I only took to this business for a freak, and I might turn my hand to something else in good time." "I'm much obliged to you for your interest in my niece, but I fear there would be objections. More than that, she is devoted to this man." "True, or I shouldn't have done what I have this morning." "Otherwise there would be no pain in the case, and you would not see me going to his house now. What was Thomasin's answer when you told her of your feelings?" "She wrote that she would object to me, and other things." "She was in a measure right. You must not take this unkindly. I merely state it as a truth. You've been good to her, and we do not forget it. But as she was unwilling on her own account to be your wife, that settles the point, without my wishes being concerned." "Yes, but there is a difference between then and now, ma'am. She is distressed now, and I have thought that if you were to talk to her about me, and think favourably of me yourself, there might be a chance of winning her round, and getting her quite independent of this Wild Eve's backward and forward play, and his not knowing whether he'll have her or no." Mrs. Yeobright shook her head. "Thomasin thinks, and I think with her, that she ought to be Wild Eve's wife, if she means to appear before the world without a slur upon her name. If they marry soon, everybody will believe that an accident did really prevent the wedding. If not, it may cast a shade upon her character, at any rate make her ridiculous. In short, if it's anyhow possible, they must marry now." I thought that till half an hour ago. But after all, why should her going off with him to Anglebury for a few hours do her any harm? Anybody who knows how pure she is will feel any such thought to be quite unjust. I've been trying this morning to help on this marriage with Wild Eve. Yes, I, ma'am, in the belief that I ought to do it because she was so wrapped up in him. But I much question if I was right after all. However, nothing came of it, and now I offer myself. Mrs. Yeobright appeared disinclined to enter further into the question. I fear I must go on, she said. I do not see that anything else can be done. And she went on. But though this conversation did not divert Thomasin's aunt from her purposed interview with Wild Eve, it made a considerable difference in her mode of conducting that interview. She thanked God for the weapon which the Reddleman had put into her hands. Wild Eve was at home when she reached the inn. He showed her silently into the parlour and closed the door. Mrs. Yeobright began, I thought it my duty to call today. A new proposal has been made to me which has rather astonished me. It will affect Thomasin greatly, and I have decided that it should at least be mentioned to you. Yes, what is it? He said civilly. It is, of course, in reference to her future. You may not be aware that another man has shown himself anxious to marry Thomasin. Now, though I have not encouraged him yet, I cannot conscientiously refuse him a chance any longer. I don't wish to be short with you, but I must be fair to him and to her. Who is the man? Said Wild Eve with surprise. One who has been in love with her longer than she has with you. He proposed to her 2 years ago. At that time she refused him. Well? He has seen her lately, and has asked me for permission to pay his addresses to her. She may not refuse him twice. What is his name? Mrs. Yeobright declined to say. He is a man Thomasin likes, she added, and one whose constancy she respects, at least. It seems to me that what she refused then, she would be glad to get now. She is much annoyed at her awkward position. She never once told me of this old lover. The gentlest women are not such fools as to show every card. Well, if she wants him, I suppose she must have him. It's easy enough to say that, but you don't see the difficulty. He wants her much more than she wants him, and before I can encourage anything of the sort, I must have a clear understanding from you that you will not interfere to injure an arrangement which I promote in the belief that it is for the best. Suppose when they are engaged and everything is smoothly arranged for their marriage, that you should step between them and renew your suit. You might not win her back, but you might cause much unhappiness. Of course I should do no such thing, said Wild Eve. But they're not engaged yet. How do you know that Thomasin would accept him? That's a question I have carefully put to myself, and upon the whole the probabilities are in favour of her accepting him in time. I flatter myself that I have some influence over her. She is pliable, and I can be strong in my recommendations of him. And in your disparagement of me at the same time. Well, you may depend upon my not praising you, she said dryly. And if this seems like manoeuvring, you must remember that her position is peculiar, and that she has been hardly used. I shall also be helped in making the match by her own desire to escape from the humiliation of her present state, and a woman's pride in these cases will lead her a very great way. A little managing may be required to bring her round, but I'm equal to that, provided that you agree to the one thing indispensable, that is, to make a distinct declaration that she is to think no more of you as a possible husband. That will pique her into accepting him." "I can hardly say that just now, Mrs. Yeobright. It is so sudden." "And so my whole plan is interfered with. It is very inconvenient that you refuse to help my family, even to the small extent of saying distinctly you will have nothing to do with us." Wild Eve reflected uncomfortably. "I confess I was not prepared for this," he said. "Of course I'll give her up if you wish, if it's necessary. But I thought I might be her husband." "We've heard that before. Now, Mrs. Yeobright, don't let us disagree. Give me a fair time. I don't want to stand in the way of any better chance she may have, only I wish you had let me know earlier. I will write to you or call in a day or two. Will that suffice?" "Yes," she replied, "provided you promise not to communicate with Thomasin without my knowledge." "I promise that," he said. And the interview then terminated, Mrs. Yeobright returning homeward as she had come. By far the greatest effect of her simple strategy on that day was, as often happens, in a quarter quite outside her view when arranging it. In the first place, her visit sent Wild Eve the same evening, after dark, to Eustatia's house at Mistover. At this hour the lonely dwelling was closely blinded and shuttered from the chill and darkness without. Wild Eve's clandestine plan with her was to take a little gravel in his hand and hold it to the crevice at the top of the window shutter, which was on the outside, so that it should fall with a gentle rustle resembling that of a mouse between shutter and glass. This precaution, in attracting her attention, was to avoid arousing the suspicions of her grandfather. The soft words, "I hear, wait for me," in Eustatia's voice from within, told him that she was alone. He waited in his customary manner, by walking round the enclosure and idling by the pool, for Wild Eve was never asked into the house by his proud, though condescending mistress. She showed no sign of coming out in a hurry. The time wore on, and he began to grow impatient. In the course of 20 minutes she appeared from round the corner, and advanced as if merely taking an airing. "You would not have kept me so long had you known what I come about," he said with bitterness. "Still, you are worth waiting for." "What has happened?" said Eustacia. "I did not know you were in trouble. I, too, am gloomy enough." "I'm not in trouble," said he. "It is merely that affairs have come to a head, and I must take a clear course." "What course is that?" she asked, with attentive interest. "And can you forget so soon what I proposed to you the other night? Why, take you from this place, and carry you away with me abroad." "I have not forgotten. But why have you come so unexpectedly to repeat the question, when you only promised to come next Saturday? I thought I was to have plenty of time to consider." "Yes, but the situation is different now." "Explain to me." "I don't want to explain, for I may pain you." "But I must know the reason of this hurry." "It's simply my ardour, dear Eustacia. Everything is smooth now." "Then why are you so ruffled?" "I'm not aware of it. All is as it should be. Mrs. Yeobright, but she is nothing to us." "Ah, I knew she had something to do with it. Come, I don't like reserve." "No, she has nothing. She only says she wishes me to give up Thomasin because another man is anxious to marry her. The woman, now she no longer needs me, actually shows off." Wild Eve's vexation had escaped him, in spite of himself. Eustacia was silent a long while. "You are in the awkward position of an official who is no longer wanted," she said in a changed tone. "It seems so, but I've not yet seen Thomasin." "And that irritates you. Don't deny it, Damon. You are actually nettled by this slight from an unexpected quarter." "Well?" "And you come to get me because you cannot get her. This is certainly a new position altogether. I am to be a stopgap." "Please remember that I proposed the same thing the other day." Eustacia again remained in a sort of stupefied silence. What curious feeling was this coming over her? Was it really possible that her interest in Wildeve had been so entirely the result of antagonism, that the glory and the dream departed from the man with the first sound that he was no longer coveted by her rival? She was, then, secure of him at last. Thomasin no longer required him. What a humiliating victory! He loved her best, she thought, and yet, dared she to murmur such treacherous criticism ever so softly? What was the man worth, whom a woman inferior to herself did not value? The sentiment which lurks more or less in all animate nature, that of not desiring the undesired of others, was lively as a passion in the supersubtle Epicurean heart of Eustacia. Her social superiority over him, which hitherto had scarcely ever impressed her, became unpleasantly insistent, and for the first time she felt that she had stooped in loving him. "Well, darling, you agree?" said Wildeve. "If it could be London, or even Budmouth, instead of America," she murmured languidly. "Well, I will think. It is too great a thing for me to decide offhand. I wish I hated the Heath less, or loved you more." "You can be painfully frank. You loved me a month ago warmly enough to go anywhere with me." "And you loved Thomasin." "Yes, perhaps that was where the reason lay," he returned with almost a sneer. "I don't hate her now." "Exactly. The only thing is that you can no longer get her." "Come, no taunts, Eustacia, or we shall quarrel. If you don't agree to go with me, and agree shortly, I shall go by myself." "Or try Thomasin again. Damon, how strange it seems that you could have married her or me indifferently, and only have come to me because I am cheapest." Yes, it's true. There was a time when I should have exclaimed against a man of that sort and been quite wild. But it's all past now. Will you go, dearest? Come secretly with me to Bristol, marry me, and turn our backs upon this dog-hole of England for ever. Say yes." "I want to get away from here at almost any cost," she said with weariness. "But I don't like to go with you. Give me more time to decide." "I have already," said Wildeve. "Well, I give you 1 more week." "A little longer, so that I may tell you decisively. I have to consider so many things. Fancy Thomasin being anxious to get rid of you. I cannot forget it." "Never mind that. Say Monday week. I'll be here precisely at this time." "Let it be at Rainbarrow," said she. "This is too near home. My grandfather may be walking out." "Thank you, dear. On Monday week at this time I will be at the Barrow. Till then, goodbye." "Goodbye. No, you must not touch me now. Shaking hands is enough, till I have made up my mind." Eustacia watched his shadowy form till it had disappeared. She placed her hand to her forehead and breathed heavily. And then her rich, romantic lips parted under that homely impulse, a yawn. She was immediately angry at having betrayed even to herself the possible evanescence of her passion for him. She could not admit at once that she might have overestimated Wildeve, for to perceive his mediocrity now was to admit her own great folly heretofore. And the discovery that she was the owner of a disposition so purely that of the dog in the manger had something in it which at first made her ashamed. The fruit of Mrs. Yeobright's diplomacy was indeed remarkable, though not as yet of the kind she had anticipated. It had appreciably influenced Wild Eve, but it was influencing Eustacia far more. Her lover was no longer to her an exciting man whom many women strove for, and herself could only retain by striving with them. He was a superfluity. She went indoors in that peculiar state of misery which is not exactly grief, and which especially attends the dawnings of reason in the latter days of an ill-judged, transient love. To be conscious that the end of the dream is approaching, and yet has not absolutely come, is one of the most wearisome as well as the most curious stages along the course between the beginning of a passion and its end. Her grandfather had returned, and was busily engaged in pouring some gallons of newly arrived rum into the square bottles of his square cellaret. Whenever these home supplies were exhausted, he would go to the quiet woman, and, standing with his back to the fire, grog in hand, tell remarkable stories of how he had lived 7 years under the waterline of his ship, and other naval wonders, to the natives, who hoped too earnestly for a treat of ale from the teller to exhibit any doubts of his truth. He had been there this evening. "I suppose you've heard the Egdon news, Eustacia?" he said, without looking up from the bottles. "The men have been talking about it at the Woman as if it were of national importance." "I have heard none," she said. "Young Clem Yeobright, as they call him, is coming home next week to spend Christmas with his mother. He's a fine fella by this time, it seems. I suppose you remember him?" "I never saw him in my life." "Ah, true, he left before you came here. I well remember him as a promising boy." "Where has he been living all these years?" "Oh, in that rookery of pomp and vanity, Paris, I believe." End of Chapter 11. End of Book 1. Book 2. The Arrival. 1. Tidings of the Comer. On fine days at this time of the year and earlier, certain ephemeral operations were apt to disturb in their trifling way the majestic calm of Egdon Heath. They were activities which, beside those of a town, a village, or even a farm, would have appeared as the ferment of stagnation merely, a creeping of the flesh of somnolence. But here, away from comparisons, shut in by the stable hills, among which mere walking had the novelty of pageantry, and where any man could imagine himself to be Adam without the least difficulty, they attracted the attention of every bird within eyeshot, every reptile not yet asleep, and set the surrounding rabbits curiously watching from hillocks at a safe distance. The performance was that of bringing together and building into a stack the furze faggots which Humphrey had been cutting for the captain's use during the foregoing fine days. The stack was at the end of the dwelling, and the men engaged in building it were Humphrey and Sam, the old man looking on. 'Twas a fine and quiet afternoon about 3 o'clock, but the winter solstice having stealthily come on, the lowness of the sun caused the hour to seem later than it actually was, there being little here to remind an inhabitant that he must unlearn his summer experience of the sky as a dial. In the course of many days and weeks, sunrise had advanced its quarters from northeast to southeast. Sunset had receded from northwest to southwest, but Egdon had hardly heeded the change. Eustacia was indoors in the dining-room, which was really more like a kitchen, having a stone floor and a gaping chimney corner. The air was still, and while she lingered a moment here alone, sounds of voices in conversation came to her ears directly down the chimney. She entered the recess, and listening, looked up the old irregular shaft with its cavernous hollows, where the smoke blundered about on its way to the square bit of sky at the top, from which the daylight struck down with a pallid glare upon the tatters of soot draping the flue as seaweed drapes a rocky fissure. She remembered the first stack was not far from the chimney, and the voices were those of the workers. Her grandfather joined in the conversation. "That lad ought never to have left home. His father's occupation would have suited him best, and the boy should have followed on. I don't believe in these new moves in families. My father was a sailor, so was I, and so should my son have been, if I had had one." "The place he's been living at is Paris," said Humphrey, "and they tell me 'tis where the king's head was cut off years ago. My poor mother used to tell me about that business. Hummy, she used to say, I was a young maid then, and as I was at home ironing mother's caps one afternoon, the parson came in and said, 'They've cut the king's head off, Jane, and what 'twill be next, God knows.'" "Good many of us knew as well as he before long," said the captain, chuckling. "I lived 7 years under water on account of it in my boyhood, in that damned surgery of the Triumph, seeing men brought down to the cockpit with their legs and arms blown to Jericho. And so the young man has settled in Paris. Manager to a diamond merchant or some such thing, is he not?" "Yes, sir, that's it. 'Tis a blazing great business that he belongs to, so I've heard his mother say. Like a king's palace as far as diamonds go." "I can well mind when he left home," said Sam. "'Tis a good thing for the feller," said Humphrey. "A sight of times better to be selling diamonds than nobbling about here." "Must cost a good few shillings to deal at such a place." "Good few indeed, my man," replied the captain. "Yes, you may make away with a deal of money, and be neither drunkard nor glutton." "They say, too, that Clym Yeobright is become a real perusing man, with the strangest notions about things. There, that's because he went to school early, such as the school was." "Strange notions, has he?" said the old man. "There's too much of that sending to school in these days. It only does harm. Every gate post and barn's door you come to, sure to have some bad word or other chalked upon it by the young rascals. A woman can hardly pass for shame sometimes. If they'd never been taught how to write, they wouldn't have been able to scribble such villainy. Their fathers couldn't do it, and the country was all the better for it. Now, I should think, Captain, that Miss Eustacia had about as much in her head that comes from books as anybody about here." "Perhaps if Miss Eustacia, too, had less romantic nonsense in her head, it would be better for her," said the captain shortly, after which he walked away. "I say, Sam," observed Humphrey when the old man was gone, "she and Clym Yeobright would make a very pretty pigeon pair, eh? If they wouldn't, I'll be dazed. Both of one mind about niceties for certain, and learned in print, and always thinking about high doctrine. There couldn't be a better couple if they were made a purpose. Clym's family's as good as hers. Her father was a farmer, that's true, but his mother was a sort of lady, as we know. Nothing would please me better than to see them two, man and wife. They'd look very natty arm in crook together, and their best clothes on, whether or no, if he's at all the well-favoured feller he used to be." "They would, Humphrey. Well, I should like to see the chap terrible much after so many years. If I knew for certain when he was coming, I'd stroll out 3 or 4 miles to meet him, and help carry anything for him. Though I suppose he's altered from the boy he was. They say he can talk French as fast as a maid can eat blackberries, and if so, depend upon it, we who have stayed at home shall seem no more than scroff in his eyes." "Coming across the water to Budmouth by steamer, isn't he?" Yes, but how he's coming from Budmouth, I don't know. That's a bad trouble about his cousin Thomasin. I wonder such a nice-notioned feller as Clem likes to come home into it. What a nunny watch we were in, to be sure, when we heard they weren't married at all, after singing to 'em as man and wife that night. Ho! Be dazed if I should like a relation of mine to have been made such a fool of by a man. It makes the family look small. Yes, poor maid, her heart has ached enough about it. Her health is suffering from it, I hear, for she will bide entirely indoors. We never see her out now, scampering over the furze, with a face as red as a rose, as she used to do. I've heard she wouldn't have Wild Eve now if he asked her. You have? 'Tis news to me. While the furze-gatherers had desultorily conversed thus, Eustatia's face gradually bent to the hearth in a profound reverie, her toe unconsciously tapping the dry turf, which lay burning at her feet. The subject of this discourse had been keenly interesting to her. A young and clever man was coming into that lonely heath from, of all contrasting places in the world, Paris. 'Twas like a man coming from heaven. More singular still, the heath-men had instinctively coupled her and this man together in their minds as a pair born for each other. That 5 minutes of overhearing furnished Eustacia with visions enough to fill the whole blank afternoon. Such sudden alternations from mental vacuity do sometimes occur thus quietly. She could never have believed in the morning that her colourless inner world would, before night, become as animated as water under a microscope, and that without the arrival of a single visitor. The words of Sam and Humphrey on the harmony between the unknown and herself had on her mind the effect of the invading bard's prelude in the Castle of Indolence, at which myriads of imprisoned shapes arose where had previously appeared the stillness of a void. Involved in these imaginings, she knew nothing of time. When she became conscious of externals, it was dusk. The furze rick was finished, the men had gone home. Eustacia went upstairs, thinking that she would take a walk at this her usual time, and she determined that her walk should be in the direction of Bloom's End, the birthplace of young Yeobright and the present home of his mother. She'd no reason for walking elsewhere, and why should she not go that way? The scene of a daydream is sufficient for a pilgrimage at 19. To look at the palings before the Yeobright's house had the dignity of a necessary performance. Strange that such a piece of idling should have seemed an important errand. She put on her bonnet, and leaving the house, descended the hill on the side towards Bloom's End, where she walked slowly along the valley for a distance of 1.5 miles. This brought her to a spot in which the green bottom of the dale began to widen, the furze bushes to recede yet farther from the path on each side, till they were diminished to an isolated one here and there by the increasing fertility of the soil. Beyond the irregular carpet of grass was a row of white palings, which marked the verge of the heath in this latitude. They showed upon the dusky scene that they bordered, as distinctly as white lace on velvet. Behind the white palings was a little garden. Behind the garden, an old irregular thatched house, facing the heath, and commanding a full view of the valley. This was the obscure removed spot to which was about to return a man whose latter life had been passed in the French capital, the centre and vortex of the fashionable world. End of Chapter 1. Book 2, The Arrival. 2. The people at Bloom's End make ready. All that afternoon, the expected arrival of the subject of Eustatia's ruminations created a bustle of preparation at Bloom's End. Thomasin had been persuaded by her aunt, and by an instinctive impulse of loyalty towards her cousin Clym, to bestir herself on his account with an alacrity unusual in her during these most sorrowful days of her life. At the time that Eustacia was listening to the rickmaker's conversation on Clym's return, Thomasin was climbing into a loft over her aunt's fuel house, where the store apples were kept, to search out the best and largest of them for the coming holiday time. The loft was lighted by a semicircular hole, through which the pigeons crept to their lodgings in the same high quarters of the premises, and from this hole the sun shone in a bright yellow patch upon the figure of the maiden as she knelt and plunged her naked arms into the soft brown fern, which, from its abundance, was used on Egdon in packing away stores of all kinds. The pigeons were flying about her head with the greatest unconcern, and the face of her aunt was just visible above the floor of the loft, lit by a few stray motes of light, as she stood halfway up the ladder, looking at a spot into which she was not climber enough to venture. "Now a few russets, Tamsin. He used to like them almost as well as ribstones." Thomasin turned and rolled aside the fern from another nook, where more mellow fruit greeted her with its ripe smell. Before picking them out, she stopped a moment. "Dear Clym, I wonder how your face looks now," she said, gazing abstractedly at the pigeon-hole, which admitted the sunlight so directly upon her brown hair and transparent tissues that it almost seemed to shine through her. "If he could have been dear to you in another way," said Mrs. Yeobright from the ladder, "this might have been a happy meeting." "Is there any use in saying what can do no good, aunt?" "Yes," said her aunt with some warmth, "to thoroughly fill the air with the past misfortune, so that other girls may take warning and keep clear of it." Thomasin lowered her face to the apples again. "Oh, I am a warning to others, just as thieves and drunkards and gamblers are," she said in a low voice. "What a class to belong to! Do I really belong to them? 'Tis absurd. Yet why, aunt, does everybody keep on making me think that I do, by the way they behave towards me? Why don't people judge me by my acts? Now look at me as I kneel here picking up these apples. Do I look like a lost woman? I wish all good women were as good as I," she added vehemently. "Strangers don't see you as I do," said Mrs. Yeobright. "They judge from false report. Well, 'tis a silly job, and I am partly to blame." "How quickly a rash thing can be done," replied the girl. Her lips were quivering, and tears so crowded themselves into her eyes that she could hardly distinguish apples from fern as she continued industriously searching to hide her weakness. "As soon as you've finished getting the apples," her aunt said, descending the ladder, "come down, and we'll go for the holly. There's nobody on the heath this afternoon, and you need not fear being stared at. We must get some berries, or Clym will never believe in our preparations." Thomasin came down when the apples were collected, and together they went through the white palings to the heath beyond. The open hills were airy and clear, and the remote atmosphere appeared, as it often appears on a fine winter day, in distinct planes of illumination, independently toned, the rays which lit the nearer tracts of landscape streaming visibly across those farther off. A stratum of ensaffroned light was imposed on a stratum of deep blue, and behind these lay still remoter scenes, wrapped in frigid grey. They reached the place where the hollies grew, which was in a conical pit, so that the tops of the trees were not much above the general level of the ground. Thomasin stepped up into a fork of one of the bushes, as she had done under happier circumstances on many similar occasions, and with a small chopper that they had brought, she began to lop off the heavily buried boughs. "Don't scratch your face," said her aunt, who stood at the edge of the pit, regarding the girl as she held on amid the glistening green and scarlet masses of the tree. "Will you walk with me to meet him this evening?" "I should like to, else it would seem as if I'd forgotten him," said Thomasin, tossing out a bough. "Not that that would matter much. I belong to one man. Nothing can alter that. And that man I must marry for my pride's sake." "Oh, I'm afraid," began Mrs. Yeobright. "Ah, you think? That weak girl, how is she going to get a man to marry her when she chooses? But let me tell you one thing, Aunt. Mr. Wildeve is not a profligate man, any more than I am an improper woman. He has an unfortunate manner, and doesn't try to make people like him, if they don't wish to do it of their own accord." "Thomasin," said Mrs. Yeobright quietly, fixing her eye upon her niece, "do you think you deceive me in your defence of Mr. Wildeve?" "How do you mean?" "I have long had a suspicion that your love for him has changed its colour since you found him not to be the saint you thought him, and that you act a part to me." "He wished to marry me, and I wish to marry him. Now I put it to you, would you at this present moment agree to be his wife, if that had not happened to entangle you with him?" Thomasin looked into the tree and appeared much disturbed. "Aunt," she said presently, "I have, I think, a right to refuse to answer that question." "Yes, you have." "You may think what you choose. I have never implied to you by word or deed that I have grown to think otherwise of him, and I never will, and I shall marry him." "Well, wait till he repeats his offer. I think he may do it now that he knows something I told him. I don't for a moment dispute that it is the most proper thing for you to marry him. Much as I have objected to him in bygone days, I agree with you now, you may be sure. It is the only way out of a false position, and a very galling one." "What did you tell him?" "That he was standing in the way of another lover of yours." "Aunt!" said Thomasin, with round eyes. "What do you mean?" "Don't be alarmed. It was my duty. I can say no more about it now, but when it's over I will tell you exactly what I said, and why I said it." Thomasin was, perforce, content. "And you will keep the secret of my would-be marriage from Clem for the present?" she next asked. "I've given my word to. But what is the use of it? He must soon know what has happened. A mere look at your face will show him that something's wrong." Thomasin turned and regarded her aunt from the tree. "Now, hearken to me," she said, her delicate voice expanding into firmness by a force which was other than physical. "Tell him nothing. If he finds out that I am not worthy to be his cousin, let him. But since he loved me once, we will not pain him by telling him my trouble too soon. The air is full of the story, I know, but gossips will not dare to speak of it to him for the first few days. His closeness to me is the very thing that will hinder the tale from reaching him early. If I'm not made safe from sneers in a week or two, I will tell him myself." The earnestness with which Thomasin spoke prevented further objections. Her aunt simply said, "Very well. He should by rights have been told at the time that the wedding was going to be. He will never forgive you for your secrecy. Yes, he will, when he knows it was because I wished to spare him, and that I did not expect him home so soon. And you must not let me stand in the way of your Christmas party. Putting it off would only make matters worse. Of course I shall not. I do not wish to show myself beaten before all Egdon, and the sport of a man like Wild Eve. We have enough berries now, I think, and we'd better take them home. By the time we've decked the house with this and hung up the mistletoe, we must think of starting to meet him. Thomasin came out of the tree, shook from her hair and dress the loose berries which had fallen thereon, and went down the hill with her aunt, each woman bearing half the gathered boughs. It was now nearly 4 o'clock, and the sunlight was leaving the vales. When the west grew red, the two relatives came again from the house and plunged into the heath in a different direction from the first, towards a point in the distant highway along which the expected man was to return. End of Chapter 2. Book 2, The Arrival. 3. How a little sound produced a great dream. Eustacia stood just within the heath, straining her eyes in the direction of Mrs. Yeobright's house and premises. No light, sound, or movement was perceptible there. The evening was chilly, the spot was dark and lonely. She inferred that the guest had not yet come, and after lingering 10 or 15 minutes, she turned again towards home. She had not far retraced her steps when sounds in front of her betokened the approach of persons in conversation along the same path. Soon their heads became visible against the sky. They were walking slowly, and though it was too dark for much discovery of character from aspect, the gait of them showed that they were not workers on the heath. Eustacia stepped a little out of the foot-track to let them pass. They were 2 women and a man, and the voices of the women were those of Mrs. Yeobright and Thomasin. They went by her, and at the moment of passing appeared to discern her dusky form. There came to her ears in a masculine voice, "Good night." She murmured a reply, glided by them, and turned round. She could not for a moment believe that chance, unrequested, had brought into her presence the soul of the house she had gone to inspect, the man without whom her inspection would not have been thought of. She strained her eyes to see them, but was unable. Such was her intentness, however, that it seemed as if her ears were performing the functions of seeing as well as hearing. This extension of power can almost be believed in at such moments. The deaf Dr. Kitto was probably under the influence of a parallel fancy when he described his body as having become, by long endeavour, so sensitive to vibrations that he had gained the power of perceiving by it as by ears. She could follow every word that the ramblers uttered. They were talking no secrets, they were merely indulging in the ordinary vivacious chat of relatives who have long been parted in person, though not in soul. But it was not to the words that Eustacia listened. She could not even have recalled a few minutes later what the words were. It was to the alternating voice that gave out about 1/10 of them, the voice that had wished her good night. Sometimes his throat uttered yes, sometimes it uttered no. Sometimes it made inquiries about a time-worn denizen of the place. Once it surprised her notions by remarking upon the friendliness and geniality written in the faces of the hills around. The 3 voices passed on, and decayed and died out upon her ear. Thus much had been granted her, and all besides withheld. No event could have been more exciting. During the greater part of the afternoon she had been entrancing herself by imagining the fascination which must attend a man come direct from beautiful Paris, laden with its atmosphere, familiar with its charms. And this man had greeted her. With the departure of the figures, the profuse articulations of the women wasted away from her memory, but the accents of the other stayed on. Was there anything in the voice of Mrs. Yeobright's son, for Clym it was, startling as a sound? No, it was simply comprehensive. All emotional things were possible to the speaker of that "good night." Eustatia's imagination supplied the rest, except the solution to one riddle. What could the tastes of that man be who saw friendliness and geniality in these shaggy hills? On such occasions as this, 1,000 ideas pass through a highly charged woman's head, and they indicate themselves on her face. But the changes, though actual, are minute. Eustatia's features went through a rhythmical succession of them. She glowed. Remembering the mendacity of the imagination, she flagged. Then she freshened, then she fired, then she cooled again. It was a cycle of aspects produced by a cycle of visions. Eustacia entered her own house. She was excited. Her grandfather was enjoying himself over the fire, raking about the ashes and exposing the red-hot surface of the turfs, so that their lurid glare irradiated the chimney-corner with the hues of a furnace. "Why is it that we are never friendly with the Yeobrights?" she said, coming forward and stretching her soft hands over the warmth. "I wish we were. They seem to be very nice people." "Be hanged if I know why," said the captain. "I liked the old man well enough, though he was as rough as a hedge. But you would never have cared to go there, even if you might have, I'm well sure." "Why shouldn't I?" "Your town tastes would find them far too countrified. They sit in the kitchen, drink mead and elder wine, and sand the floor to keep it clean. A sensible way of life. But how would you like it?" "I thought Mrs. Yeobright was a ladylike woman. A curate's daughter, was she not?" "Yes, but she was obliged to live as her husband did, and I suppose she's taken kindly to it by this time. I recollect I once accidentally offended her, and I've never seen her since." That night was an eventful one to Eustatia's brain, and one which she hardly ever forgot. She dreamt a dream, and few human beings, from Nebuchadnezzar to the Swaffham tinker, ever dreamt a more remarkable one. Such an elaborately developed, perplexing, exciting dream was certainly never dreamed by a girl in Eustatia's situation before. It had as many ramifications as the Cretan labyrinth, as many fluctuations as the northern lights, as much colour as a parterre in June, and was as crowded with figures as a coronation. To Queen Scheherazade the dream might have seemed not much far removed from commonplace, and to a girl just returned from all the courts of Europe it might have seemed not more than interesting. But amid the circumstances of Eustatia's life it was as wonderful as a dream could be. There was, however, gradually evolved from its transformation scenes a less extravagant episode in which the heath dimly appeared behind the general brilliancy of the action. She was dancing to wondrous music, and her partner was the man in silver armor who had accompanied her through the previous fantastic changes, the visor of his helmet being closed. The mazes of the dance were ecstatic. Soft whispering came into her ear from under the radiant helmet, and she felt like a woman in paradise. Suddenly these two wheeled out from the mass of dancers, dived into one of the pools of the heath, and came out somewhere beneath into an iridescent hollow arched with rainbows. "It must be here," said the voice by her side, and blushingly looking up she saw him removing his casque to kiss her. At that moment there was a cracking noise, and his figure fell into fragments like a pack of cards. She cried aloud, "Oh, that I had seen his face!" Eustacia awoke. The cracking had been that of the window shutter downstairs, which the maidservant was opening to let in the day, now slowly increasing to nature's meagre allowance at this sickly time of the year. "Oh, that I had seen his face!" she said again. "'Twas meant for Mr. Yeobright." When she became cooler, she perceived that many of the phases of the dream had naturally arisen out of the images and fancies of the day before. But this detracted little from its interest, which lay in the excellent fuel it provided for newly kindled fervour. She was at the modulating point between indifference and love, at the stage called having a fancy for. It occurs once in the history of the most gigantic passions, and it is a period when they are in the hands of the weakest will. The perfervid woman was by this time half in love with a vision. The fantastic nature of her passion, which lowered her as an intellect, raised her as a soul. If she had had a little more self-control, she would have attenuated the emotion to nothing by sheer reasoning, and so have killed it off. If she had had a little less pride, she might have gone and circumambulated the Yeobright's premises at Bloom's End at any maidenly sacrifice until she had seen him. But Eustacia did neither of these things. She acted as the most exemplary might have acted, being so influenced. She took an airing twice or thrice a day upon the Egdon Hills, and kept her eyes employed. The first occasion passed, and he did not come that way. She promenaded a second time, and was again the sole wanderer there. The third time there was a dense fog. She looked around, but without much hope. Even if he had been walking within 20 yards of her, she could not have seen him. At the fourth attempt to encounter him, it began to rain in torrents, and she turned back. The fifth sally was in the afternoon. It was fine, and she remained out long, walking to the very top of the valley in which Bloom's End lay. She saw the white paling about half a mile off, but he did not appear. It was almost with heart-sickness that she came home, and with a sense of shame at her weakness. She resolved to look for the man from Paris no more. But Providence is nothing if not coquettish, and no sooner had Eustacia formed this resolve than the opportunity came which, while sought, had been entirely withholden. End of chapter 3.